Welcome back to another episode of That's Business. Today's guest, Chris Lin, focuses on building people-first leaders. Chris believes true transformation only comes when we prioritize people over profits. As the founder of Leading People First and the Senior Learning and Development Manager at Patagonia, Chris is committed to the development and success not only for individuals, but for the communities they reside in. Chris, I'm so pumped to have you on the podcast today because reading that bio gave me goosebumps. Before we dive into the greatness that is you, did you always want to be someone that was, a people-first leader? Or what was your childhood like, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, to give some background on that, I grew up with Chinese immigrant parents and being a first-generation Chinese American, as well as growing up in a Christian household. There were a lot of expectations and rules and boundaries that were set for me. And growing up in that environment, I was always told, you are a leader, this is what you do. And without ever having leadership defined for me growing up, it was you're a leader. And so I grew up thinking or knowing that I was without actually knowing what it was or how to live it out. I just thought it was this innate skill that I had that I just happened to have. And then I ran into the real world and I was like, oh, there's these things that I don't know how to do. Or, the biggest lesson, or one of the biggest, I should say, lessons that I learned was how to influence without having authority. Right. And so those sort of things in leadership are things that I think were so big. But to answer your question, did I know I wanted to be a people first leader? No. Again, I didn't know what it meant. And so I slowly learned through my career, especially over the last 10 years, when organizations really did put profit over people, I was like, no, this is not a good way of working. This is not a good way to build an organizational culture. And that's where I really started leaning into this people first mindset to say, hey, people are not just numbers. They are not just a line on the P&L, right? We need to look at them as people, and how do we treat them differently than a piece of machinery or a piece of software. And so that's really where I leaned into leading people first.
So someone that may be listening that maybe doesn't know they're at a company that favors profits over people, what does that look like? Or what are some of the actions companies that don't really care about people or aren't putting people first take or do?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, most of us have been at these organizations, if not all of us. We've all experienced this, but it's really where organizations are always looking at the bottom line. They're always looking at, the numbers of sales. They're always looking at what their profitability is. And we're seeing it, especially now in 2024, when profitability is off the charts. Profitability at companies has risen crazy high, but they're still doing layoffs because they're like, nope, we need to cut costs. It's those two things don't add up. You're making record profits, but you're letting people go because you can't afford them, quote unquote, right? And so I think those are the most obvious in today's societies. I think some of the smaller pieces to really be on the lookout for is when companies are not checking in on who you are as an individual. They are only there to say, hey, what's the status of your project? Where are you at on your numbers? But they don't ask hey, how are you doing? How's your family? How are your friends? What's going on in life? Those small little things that we value in our personal relationships. The other things that I would really be on the lookout for are things like micromanaging, where they're constantly seeing are you, where are you? Are you at your desk? They are tracking if your mouse is moving, right? Those sort of things that, oversight, big brothery type of behavior just does not create a culture where it's hey, we trust you. We trust that you're going to get the work done. We believe in you to do the work. So looking out for some of those behaviors where they don't value what you bring to the table, they don't value you being able to do the work versus time spent in the office are things to really be on the lookout for.
And I think it's just been drilled into our head of you just go to work and that's it. Or now, of course, with the rise in remote work, but you should like who you work for. You really should like the people you spend at least 40 hours a week in most situations with. And I think it's interesting because the whole like, we're a family, and that turned into toxicity. But you realistically should be able to say, hey, I'm going through this situation with my partner, or hey, this situation is affecting my work. Because when you do ask the question of, like you said, hi, how are you? Or how's your family? How's this? Usually you can figure out why the numbers aren't where they need to be without saying, well, why aren't your numbers there, and adding the stress there. But where I feel you preach and it makes sense, like the profits come. If you focus on your people, the profits come easy. I mean, not easy in all situations,
Exactly.
but
Yeah.
you know this.
Well, I mean, like, again, when it comes to profits, I'm not saying or discounting or dismissing the need for profitability. 100%. Like, we live in the real world. You have to be profitable to have a business. I'm not discounting that. But rather, we need to shift this mindset. When we only focus on profitability, it is a short-term view versus we need to shift it to becoming long-term. And by doing that is to invest in your people, to really care about your people and trust that they're going to do the work and care for them enough that they will do good work and enable them to do good work. And then the profitability will come. And we see this back and forth as we go back and forth between recessions and periods of growth, is that during recession times, investment in people programs like learning and development, like talent programs, like certification programs, or, education programs, those drop. Companies pull back on those during recession times. Like we saw this during the very start of the pandemic when everyone was freaking out and tightening their belts. They're like, nope, we need to not spend money right now because we don't know how long this is going to last. And employee programs dropped. And then when it got time where it's like, oh, we're okay, and we normalized with the pandemic, and productivity started shooting through the roof, all of a sudden, all these companies freaked out because they're like, oh my gosh, we don't have enough people to do the work. We don't have enough skill set to do the work. That could have been mitigated a little bit if we said, hey, this is a slow period. Let's invest in your learning. Let's invest in your development. Let's invest in making sure that you're okay during this very stressful time of a global pandemic. So it's times like that when an organization really does focus on its people to say, hey, we can come out of this tough period by focusing on our people versus the profit.
Right. And I think the pandemic was just so eye-opening for not only employees, I mean, of course, employees number one, but employers, and this whole, oh, we need the skills or we need to hire. And then, of course, now we're seeing layoffs happen, and just informing people they didn't do the human capital planning of, okay, what happens when we're not at these peak profits, or what's happening in different years. And it's just so frustrating of, you don't want to put your people last, or it's like you said, learning and development, or we don't need to really focus on that. And It's just crazy. I mean, not to get on my soapbox, but I live on it. So where did this come from as far as when did you start leading people first, and what kind of led up to you being like, all right, I need to do something about this?
Yeah, the first time I experienced this was when I was a survivor from a layoff about 10 or so years ago. It was a healthcare organization, and they cut the very first department that took care of patients.
Oh.
As they expanded that department into other cities that were lower cost. Mm-hmm. Justifiable, right? But then rather than say, hey, you've been this crux, this heart of our organization, rather than let's redistribute you throughout the organization, or let's find something else for you to do, it was quote unquote cheaper to just cut them and let them go. And the justification that was given then was that, well, this is a business decision. It's like, everyone understands the business, everyone understands the logic, but not everyone understands the heart. People don't, emotionally, it doesn't feel right? From our gut, it doesn't feel right. And that's where I really started to look in and say, why do companies make these decisions that absolutely rock their cultures, right? Because all of a sudden what we saw was the organization lost trust in its executives. It said, well, that was the culture center of our organization. Cutting that, all of a sudden, you've dissipated that. That no longer exists. How do we pick up the pieces? And it took an incredibly long time for us to even get remotely close to where it used to be. Because so much of that culture knowledge and culture experience was lost. So how did we pivot to be able to bring that culture back? So that was my first foray. And then when it came to the pandemic and I started seeing, fast forward 5 years and the pandemic came along and I'm like, hey, we're seeing all of these organizations look only internally looking at their bottom lines. And that's really where I came to this notion of we really need managers and leaders to look at their people in order to say, hey, this is where we can grow. This is where we can absolutely rocket from a business standpoint is by looking at our employees. And that's actually where I started my own podcast at that point and really talking to individuals to say, hey, you don't have to be in a position of authority to be able to lead people first. Leading, again, back to my own experience, can come from anywhere in the organization. And that's really where we can create these cultures and this mindset of focusing on people over profit.
Right. And I love that you bring up it's not necessarily leading people, because I think that's where we got away from is it's like, oh, well, I haven't led people. I haven't led this. It's like, well, are you someone people can rely on? Did you give a junior employee a little piece of advice that maybe didn't mean anything to you, but meant something to them? Or did you stick up there's so many different ways of leadership. And what a lot of people don't realize is when you do lay someone off, the cost of training and development, wild, versus if you look at if you would have spent the money on learning and development versus if you're going to just cut those employees or hire someone new because we need it, it's cheaper. Learning and development wins all day, every day. So kind of transitioning to what you do with your company and now, of course, what you do with Patagonia, what is learning and development? I mean, I know the greatness that is you, but for those people that may be listening to this and like, wow, I don't know, I don't need that at my company and I feel good. Why is it so important?
Learning and development is all about upskilling your employees and upskilling yourself. In many organizations, corporations, especially mid to large size enterprise companies, they have some sort of learning and development function. And oftentimes it actually rolls into our benefits. So things like education reimbursement is very popular. So if you go and get a degree, they will reimburse a certain amount, right? And so again, learning and development is the function of a company, and it often sits under human resources where you are learning and upskilling yourself. And from a company standpoint, it's selfish, right? It is selfish to say, yep, we're upskilling you for our benefit, but really for you as an individual, it's how can I progress in my career? Or how can I become better in my role? And so that is the function of learning and development, is to level employees up, either in their role or to level them up into a role for the future, or to give them skills that they didn't think that they needed prior. And I'll point to AI as a huge disruptor. AI came so quick and so fast, a year and a half ago at this point, and now we're seeing a lot of organizations really leaning into AI, for better or for worse. And we need employees now who know how AI works. And so learning and development could serve as that function to say, hey, let's do the research, let's do the analysis, and how do we teach our employees to use AI in their roles or for the betterment of their roles or to increase productivity.
It's so true. And it's such a great point to bring up, because it was like, AI, what? What is this thing? And this whole blockchain and Internet of Things. Then it's like, all right, now it's in your face. And if you're not jumping on the train, you're behind everyone.
Yeah.
So how you work, and of course, managing a company, working for Patagonia, how do you work day to day, or what has your journey been? Because if I remember correctly, it's been just over a year at Patagonia, or it's been a few years, but
yeah.
How did that kind of come up while you're owning your own business? Because a lot of people ask me these kind of questions. So I want to hear your point of view.
Yeah. So I was actually laid off from my last full-time role, which was a startup. And I was job hunting for a good 6 months before I landed at Patagonia. And so it's not like I just happened upon it. I was able to lean on my network a little bit, and several people pointed out this role to me at Patagonia. They're like, Chris, this is your role. And it was awesome because I had been targeting Patagonia for years at this point.
Nice.
And I was able to go through the motions and get interviewed and ultimately get hired. And really, it was just such a fun, it just really points to aligning your own values to what you're looking for. And so what I'll also call out there is that we are never going to find like an organization that 100% aligns with our values or 100% of our purpose, right? Like it's so important to say like, can I work with like half of the values aligning, or can I work with like 70%? It's your own comfortability, but it's been a journey to really look at what do I ultimately care about? And for me, it's about, do I care about equitability in our environments and our communities? I care about, diversity and inclusion and the balance between organization and people. And I felt that Patagonia does this really well, right? For them, it's about balancing the impact that they as an organization or we as a society have on the planet and how that then translates to the impact to us as human beings on Earth. So really looking at like those values and seeing what do I want to do and how can I make an impact? That's where I focused in on when I was searching.
The values piece of it, you're never going to find 100% the values at a company. And I just really want to stress that to anyone listening. But whether you did like a cost benefit analysis or what made the most sense, obviously equitability, DEI that you've brought up too. But I have a lot of people I work with on the resume rescue side that are number one on the far side of, I don't care, I just need a job, my bills are adding up. And then on the other side, who are like, I need to have all these things or I'm not interested. So what was your method of like coming up with something in the middle or something that, okay, you knew Patagonia was the one?
Yeah, so I inadvertently did this exercise for myself several years ago, and then I've actually built it into some of my learning programs.
Oh, nice.
So what I would recommend is you identify what your purpose is first and foremost. What is your own driving force? What is your why, right? Like Simon Sinek talks about that all the time, and that's what he's launched off of. But really what I want every person to do is to identify their own purpose, identify your why. Right. And that could be by looking at what are some of the scenarios or situations where you constantly lean in. You're constantly like, yep, I'm drawn to that all the time. And you can even take this a step further by going to like your close friends and family and asking them, when have you seen me at my best? Or like your coworkers as well. Like, when have you seen me really lean into projects? What was the scenario? What was happening and what did I do? And you'll be able to find themes there. And so for myself, I was looking at situations of, well, what situations was I really thriving? And for me, it was making sure that I could help anyone who was in a certain situation and make sure they can get through that situation, making sure that they had the skills or they had the abilities to work through that and then excel from there. And so what I landed on for my purpose was that I want to make sure that I help anyone succeed in whatever role that they're in or whatever role that they want, which like pairs perfectly with L&D. Like I didn't mean to do that, but I did happen to find the work that I love to do. So start with your purpose. Where do you want to be and what do you want to do? And then from there, identify, Brene Brown has a great values worksheet and activity. So look at some of the values that really call out to you. For me, again, that was equitability. For me, that was compassion. For me, that was, again, people first. So looking at those values then and saying, okay, what organizations truly value those things and which is my non-negotiable, right? Which one is like my absolute, like I have to have? Because we do, again, as awful as it might sound, we do have to flex our values here and there. Like that's just human nature. That's life. Like we just do. What are one or two values that you absolutely have to have in an organization or in a manager? And that will help narrow down that search or help you identify whether or not you're in the right organization. And then from there, you can really target those companies.
Now, people that have experienced the micromanaging, work PTSD, maybe coming off of a layoff and coming off of, insert awful situation here that I hear a lot of the stories of, and I'm sure you have too. What are some baby steps they can take? And the values, I cannot tell you, I thought it would be easy. It is so hard to do. The Brene Brown one, I love. I've read every single one of her books she's ever published, but it's hard. So if someone's not ready, they're like, oh, I just need a job, or I just am so in my own head about it. What are some little baby steps they can take to then be ready to like take on a new opportunity or role?
Yeah, I would say the little steps for people to take are just do some self-reflection. Maybe you don't do a full values exercise or you don't do a purpose exercise. As individuals, for us to grow, we do need to reflect. We do need to understand ourselves and who we are and understand maybe why we're not happy in the roles that we're in, right? If you haven't articulated it, you just, at the end of the day, come home, or in my case, I walk out the office and I go to my family. But, it might just be like, oh man, today sucked. Or I hate working here. Why? What happened? What are the things that are happening that are really turning you off or really tiring you out? Do you even recognize that the fatigue you're feeling is coming from work and maybe not from something else? And being able to differentiate those things. I think you called out earlier, someone might be dealing with something personal and that might be fatiguing them versus the work. So can you identify what is causing you stress? What's causing you to be tired all the time? And then once you've identified those things, it's to say, okay, if this is a work-related instance, what is it about it? Is it my boss? Is it the company? I'll use Google as an example. They have their motto, or recently had their motto be do no evil, or that was one of their values, right? And a lot of the employees started speaking up against it because Google as an organization was contracting with a bunch of governments that employees felt were evil and they didn't agree with. So is it the work? Is it the company? What might it be? And then from there, start those steps to say, okay, well, this is where I want to be, or this is what I want to do next. I will also shout out another fantastic tool called UMAP by Kristen Sherry. Angela, you're nodding. I think you've heard of it.
I have, yes. But please explain it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so UMAP is a fantastic book by Kristen Sherry. There's so many tools and personality tests and different things out there, but you don't know what to do with it at the end of the day. What UMAP is, and Kristen Sherry has done, is she's identified, I think, like 5 or 6 assessments for you to take. And then it creates a map of yourself, hence the term UMAP. And then it will tell you what you can do with that information next and how to highlight them as you're having conversations, as you're interviewing. So I would highly recommend that book to someone who is in the gray of not knowing what to do or not knowing what next steps to take. Because by understanding, again, yourself or reflecting on who you are will empower you and enable you to do what you need is best for yourself.
I was fired, as I shared with you before. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you've heard the story 5 freaking million times. But you feel so lost, whether you're going through something personally, you log into your computer and find it doesn't work because you were laid off, or just all these situations. And it's so hard to come up out of that depths of despair, especially if money is tight or anything. But you should be working on this constantly. This shouldn't be when these big situations happen, or doing a little values quiz that I found was fun, or this UMapping, which will be linked in the show notes. But doing these little things that you feel prepared, or you're not just totally devastated if something happens. And if the pandemic or the last few years have taught us anything, is nothing is guaranteed. And a lot of people's true colors came out. And it's not even a selfish thing when you're focusing on your own development, your own learning, your own advanced skill set. Because I've had that from especially new parents, or just like, well, I don't want to take away from time from my kids, or time from my partner, or time from whatever X is. But you have to look out for yourself too. And this helps you. This translates over to your personal life and professional life. So on that note, what have you kind of seen either with your company, with Patagonia, as far as maybe a success story you can share with us of someone you've worked with that you've really seen, a transformation?
Yeah, well, first, before I go into that, I have to shout out again and reinforce the need to be selfish, especially in this type of market.
Yes.
Even if we are in a growth market where companies are doing really well, again, like I said before, they don't care. They don't care. They will still lay people off despite record profits. So be selfish. Do what's best for you. whatever that might mean. If that's money, if that's job security, if that's working, remote, whatever it is, do what's best for you and be selfish, because at the end of the day, the company will not, unless you are like a top level executive. So please do what's best for you. Do everything. Take advantage of every benefit there is available to you to invest in yourself. To your question, though, around, who I've seen a huge transformation from, I've seen several where really it was more about getting individuals to buy into what leading people first is. And these aren't individuals who, I necessarily coached or did business with, but more people I've built friendships along the way with. And I'll shout those people out, is like Yvonne Alston, who is the founder of Indelible Impressions, a DEI firm out in Connecticut. Van Lai Dumont, who is a entrepreneur here in California, who just actually recently wrote an amazing book called Can Pigs Fly? That's really focused on like curiosity and what curiosity can do. So it's more about the individuals that I've talked to and had built these friendships with, that when they are living out this leading people first mindset, where they're really focusing on the impact that they have as individuals on others. And again, it's not necessarily to say, hey, I'm going to make an impact on someone today, or like, I'm going to make an impact on you today, Angela. It's no, like, what can I do to build the relationship between us, and how can I help you achieve your goals? That relationship strengthens and allows them to grow and expand their influence. The metaphor I constantly use with Yvonne is dropping the pebble in the water and watching the ripples flow out. The ripples expand and get much larger, right? And so by taking that one little action with the individual that you're talking with, again, it could be a coworker, it could be someone junior to you, it could be someone that reports to you, it could even be your manager, but just building that relationship and having that people first mindset will allow them to expand on that and will help you expand your own influence and reach. And people will be drawn to that, right? And that's why, those individuals are, I would say, so successful, is because they allow themselves to help others versus the business mindset of like, what can I get out of my people? It's like, what can I put into others to help them grow and expand?
Everything does not need to be transactional. The transactions will come if you focus on people, as the whole point of this whole podcast, amongst other things, right? Reoccurring theme here, Chris. But as we wrap this up, what advice do you have for listeners?
I would just, harp on what I just said and reinforce what I just said, is really think about what you can do for others, I should say. How can you help the person next to you? How can you invest in them so they are successful? Again, that speaks more to my own purpose and like wanting to make sure others succeed. However, for us, especially as we get older, relationships are harder to build, much harder to build. And so as adults, by pouring into someone else just a little bit will create a bond between the two of you, and that will help. And then they will reciprocate that in some way in the future. That has always been true in everything that I've done, is that I always ask, well, what can I do for you? What can I do for you right now? Right. And it has to be something I can actually take action on, versus the, hey, how can I help you? Oh, I'll let you know. And like, oh, well, how can I help you? Oh, I'll let you know. Don't make it a, hey, how you doing kind of conversation. Make it a, what can I do for you right now to help you succeed or to help you achieve your goals? And by having that conversation will allow that person to grow and then look back and say, wow, that conversation I had with Angela was so impactful. I didn't know it at the moment, but it was so critical for me. And by building those relationships, you build your own influence and you become more of a people leader in that way.
So true. I'm just sitting over here nodding my head. My head's going to fall off a swivel, I swear, because I'm like, yep, everything you said. I could not agree with more. So if you're listening to this, you're inspired like I am to connect with Chris, see what he's got going on, head to the show notes for all those references we brought up, to follow Chris, give him some love, and tune in again next week for another episode of That's Business.